So we're talking about what to do when you've blown it with God, and we're using for our text in this study Psalm 51. This is the Psalm of David following his affair with Bathsheba. One of the things that we need to do when we've blown it with God is we need to become resensitized spiritually. That David in his own life had grown calloused to the things of God, and it wasn't until Nathan came along and rebuked him that then he turned back to the Lord in repentance. And so there are a few things that can help us to become resensitized spiritually. Number one is that we have to own it when we've sinned. And you notice there in verse number 3 in this text, David says, "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me." Instead of making excuses and justifying ourselves or blaming someone else, what David did and what each one of us need to do when we've blown it with God is we need to own our sin. But secondly, what we need to do is that we need to face its impact. And David does this in verse number 4, and it seems to be a little strange verse when we first read it. But I think that as you compare it in other translations, you get the full understanding of what David says here. In verse 4, he says, "Against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight." And so David is not excusing himself by saying that he hasn't sinned against Bathsheba and he hasn't sinned against Uriah. What he's really doing is saying that my sin goes all the way up to the top, and it's not just an offense against these individuals. He's speaking in hyperbole here, but he's saying that his offense truly is an offense against God. And we need to understand that every time we've blown it with God, what our offense really amounts to is an offense against God. Now, God is merciful and God is gracious, but he also wants us to understand the impact of our sin. Number 3 is that we need to acknowledge our own nature. And David does this in verse number 5, where he says, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." And what he's saying is that he's always had this inclination, as all of us do, this inclination towards sin. And so it's something that we're going to be struggling with our whole lives long. When we come to Christ, we have a new nature, but that old man, that old person is always trying to reassert his dominance in our life. And what we have to do is continually fight and resist that with the Spirit's power. And another thing that we need to do if we're going to resensitize our hearts after we've blown it with God is that we need to welcome transformation. You notice there in verse number 10, David invites God and he says this, "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." What David is really hungering for in this passage is personal transformation. And that's the sure way to resensitize our hearts towards God once we've blown it with him. We want to continue on in our study of Psalm 51, of what to do when you've blown it with God. And so make sure you come back for the next episode. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and keep coming back. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. We'll see you later.